Hi there, this is Carl Irwin, and this is a tutorial. We're going to continue our series here looking at scoring to picture in various ways. We looked first at a soundscape, atmospheric sort of approach using a workstation and then some synthesizer sounds and very minimalist kinds of sounds, very common today, very popular among film composition today. And I think at the end of all this, we'll have a follow-up video, a short follow-up where we look at all three of these together, and I will give some opinions about each one, each type. The second type that we looked at was a contemporary sort of scoring. And I think contemporary is a little bit different from atmospheric because the atmospheric angle is kind of uniquely chosen. It's not the most typical way to score these days. I think that the more common contemporary type is sort of that Hans Zimmer uses some of that synth droning, but there's some hybrid orchestral material happening, ostinato patterns. It's a very well-known sound that appears in television and movies today, and has for the better part of the last 15 years or so. So this is going to be a classical kind of approach, a classic approach to film score, where we're looking at notation primarily. Now, I just have to point out that many composers today who wrote in the more classic sense, where they would do mathematical timing and then write to score, have now adopted the workstation approach, where they play in using MIDI interface into a workstation project, and then they take that data that has been mocked up using sound libraries and whatnot, and then that data is turned then into notation, and then that notation is used to record the final scoring session. So in spite of that, let's look at notation as the principal mode for composing. Some people still do this, some even by hand. We're going to do kind of a bit of a mixed approach here. We're going to be using notation, but we're going to be using technology to help us sort of create our timing map. So I have a couple of videos already on the channel that look at how to do timing. One looks at the mathematical approach to sorting out what the timing is using SMPTE timecode, and then mathematical equations to create timing. And then from there you can create a tempo map where you can set tempos and meter changes and whatnot to align particular hits that are of interest in the best place musically. And then you have a canvas on which you can write music. I have another video on there where you do the same process, but you do it more directly from picture, and that's what we have here. We have a synced picture. This is MuseScore 3.6, which still has the synchronization capability using jack transport. And then I have here, in this case, Blender is the video playback. And the benefit to Blender is that you can actually place the sound for the video inside of it, and you have cross sync. So this is Blender 2.79, one of the previous versions of Blender that has a very, very robust application of jack sync, where whenever I press in a certain place on the timeline in Blender, it will automatically sync to MuseScore. The most recent versions of Blender don't do that quite as well. So let's play this and see. I've already spotted these hits, and what I've done is I just have a snare rim sound, and then I have added staff text to indicate what is happening, when it's happening. I have large text for kind of large scene changes. Then I have a smaller text for specific actions that are happening within the scene. And we'll just play this, and you can see that it does indeed sync together, and we have an accurate timing. So very dark visual here, but you can see that these clicks are happening with the shot changes. I've selected a simple meter and to start with 4/4 and a tempo 120. Kept it simple. And each one of these hits is within that kind of quarter of a second requirement that you need to psychologically force the association of a sound with an image. Now, most of our cues are not going to align exactly with these hits and with these occurrences. They're going to happen, in most cases, just after, as an accentuation of what has occurred. Now, the reason why I've indicated these big kind of conceptual terms is because in the end, what we're going to do is we're going to be writing apart from the picture. We're using the picture really just to give us an outline of concepts, and we're going to acquaint ourselves enough with the picture so that we can write apart from it. We're going to do one more step in sync here, and that is going to involve the addition of some non-functional chord relationships. I'm just going to create some chords that are going to align with the picture and with these changes that give sort of a non-functional harmonic, but a harmonic nonetheless, sense of emotion and feeling that we can use as a base on which to compose our layers of music. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Okay, so here I've sketched out some chords. And one thing you want to do is you want to make multiple files. I think when you're taking this approach, you don't want to work on one file and you keep editing that file. Make sure you make separate files that you can always refer back to. If you have a loss of data, you can always take a step back to the most recent kind of point in the workflow. So this has all of our hits on it that have been designed, and then it also has just, again, non-functional chords. Now, it's going to sound like some of these chords have function, but when we say non-functional, what we mean is that we're not really tonicizing anything in particular for any length of time. There's no key signature here. We're just working with chord relationships that evoke kind of emotional qualities, and many of these are not going to be very overt in the final composition. A lot of this will kind of disappear into the orchestration. We'll have kind of short, small things happening, but not really sustained or organ-like chords. This is just this is akin to slopping a big ball of clay on the wheel before you start making pottery. And that's the goal here. So let's just listen to this. And I have already a concept of a workflow that I'm going to follow. I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to kind of score out my strings, my underlying strings, and then I'm going to deal with the winds, and then finally I'll deal with the percussion at the end. And that's kind of how I'm going to approach this. Now, you don't have to do that, and that isn't always the way that I approach scoring to picture. You can start with kind of melodic material or motivic material and sketch that out first, and then work away harmonically from that. There's a lot of ways that you can work. It's just in this case, I'm going to start very broadly with these chord qualities. So let's take a quick listen. And many of these hits on the chords are not going to be precise on the hits. Again, there's this concept of Mickey Mousing that we've talked about in other videos, where you are doing something on absolutely every single hit. And we don't really want to do that. Also, understand, I know there's some parallelisms going on here and some planing, right? Again, this is non-functional harmony. It's just relationship, intervallic relationship harmonies. Some things will sound a little bit more major and heroic. Some things will sound darker. You can see some of these chords, they don't even really address the hits that are happening in the picture. Kind of have a vamp on two chords here. And then one final arrival. in tonality. Okay, so the next step here is going to be to stretch this out into what I'm going to do is stretch this out into string orchestration. So I'm going to put my entire template together with all the instrumentation that I want for the ensemble, but I'm going to first start by scoring in the strings, put in some of those ostinato patterns, some basic melodic material, and try to turn this sort of chord progression element into some underlying string orchestration on which I can place my wind and my percussion music. Okay, so we're going to jump over to Muse Score 4, where we have the Muse sounds, and the reason why I'm doing this is because once you've heard the Muse sounds, you just can't go back. And this is kind of the unfortunate thing I've mentioned, and I'll keep saying it until something's done or until people stop listening. I don't know, whichever comes first. It's very unfortunate that the synchronization in Muse Score has been lost with the dropping of Jack support. I don't know that it's going to come back. There's not really serious discussion about bringing it back. Most of the discussion is about how antiquated it is, but nonetheless, once you've used these sounds, they're just so helpful in composing, where you can hear immediately what it is you're getting at in realistic playback. So I'm going to jump over here. I have enough in my map between the map itself and the harmonic material. And then having seen the picture enough, I think I can write now, kind of in the classic way, to picture without having to look directly at the picture. I know my timings. I know where things are happening. I know what's going on. So what I've done here is I put together a complete template with tall time signatures just so I can get quick reference and see. This is something you do whenever you're going to print out a score for people to look at. And it's just a practice that I've gotten used to whenever I'm doing this kind of scoring that is for picture. If I was doing orchestral scoring, I wouldn't bother with this. It would be a little bit more kind of traditional. Another thing I want to point out as you look at this, there are some quirks in the Muse Score, Muse Sounds playback in the Play Engine because of this very early stage in its development. Sometimes dynamics don't pick up properly, even if they're assigned in the right place, and you'll get some glitches on the whenever you render out. So as a practice, when I have very stark dynamic changes, I will place the dynamic ahead of the dynamic again in a rest space if it's available. And if not, sometimes I'll cut a note short just to create some of that space. It's just a little hack that you can use to get some clean renders. Now, I'm approaching this scoring not as if I was creating this for people to read. I am approaching this scoring for me to read quickly and understand, but I'm approaching it as if this is a digital audio workstation. I am not concerned about the notation. I am concerned about the playback. This is a playback file, and this is something that those of us that used notation applications 20-some years ago or more, we would make a version of our score that was to be read and to be exported, but then those of us working back then, we would also make a version of the score that would have additional indications to make the playback more realistic. This is kind of a carryover from that. What we're doing is we're creating things in the score that work against some of the quirkiness of the application, ways that the application doesn't quite satisfy everything absolutely. And we're trying to get an absolute solid playback. So we'll have a redundancy in dynamics and some dynamics placed in these places and some other things that you'll notice in here. Just know that I fully appreciate that this is not how it would be scored. I have everything in concert pitch. I'm just going for ease of sight and reading and ease of writing and accuracy of playback. That's what we're looking at. We're not looking at the notational value here. We're looking at the sound value. Okay, so that's my soapbox. Now I can step down. Let's take a look at what we've done here. So without the picture, you know that the hits line up. Let's just listen to this underlying string section. Okay, so a couple things here. We're going to end with this fade, which is a very good idea whenever you're writing a cue, and it's going to need to mesh with other cues. That's not the case here, but it just helps for editorial processes later when you have a little bit of material there on the end that you can cut short or extend with a crossfade if you need to, or you can crossfade into with another cue. A few things about this. You'll notice some very specific articulations in there that might not be typical to the way you would write this. Another thing about using MuseScore 4 is that there is a variety of samples to different articulations, and sometimes some articulations sound more authentic than others for other purposes. So I really like the staccato accent articulation here, more so than just the mere accent or just leaving it alone. And I use that. So you'll see a lot of that kind of stuff going on in here. Just a very specific, particular choices for different kinds of articulations. There is a harmonic value here that is faithful to the sketch that I made. However, what we're going to do next is I'm going to start adding in other instrumentation. So if we look at my instrumentation here, I have at the top here my woodwinds complement, brass complement, and then some very basic percussion. I'm going to start with the winds, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert some stabs and hits and runs and motivic material, which I might derive from some of the things that just happened down here, and we'll try to take some ideas that we can really latch onto and spin them out and give them repetition to give the score a little bit of identity. Again, this is underscore. This is not thematic scoring. This is underscore. This is not a big thematic moment. We're just kind of accompanying the motion of the picture with elements that are gestures. And this is where classic scoring is very much like the atmospheric scoring that we looked at the beginning of this exercise with the synthesizers. Essentially, we're doing the same thing that we did there. We're just doing more of it. We're being more particular about it, and we're using classic instrumentation to accomplish it. So in that regard, we really don't need to be faithful to this harmonic material. What we're going to do is we're going to be very non-tonal. I don't know if you'd say atonal, but non-tonal. We're going to separate by instrumentation and range some other harmonic material that may not really associate with the material down here all of the time. And that will create a interesting kind of, if it was heard by itself, avant-garde sort of sound. But with the picture, it will help to elevate the picture and the things that are happening in the picture while creating the kinds of tension that we want. So let's flesh out those next parts here with the brass and woodwinds. Okay, so we have some wind parts placed in here. Again, as I said before, we're going for sound. We're not going for notation. We're trying to use the proper samples given the sample sets that they have and whatever articulations get to those samples. There's some doubling going on of some of the things that are happening in the strings, but in general, we are contrasting this string canvas underneath, this palette of color that is kind of the background of the score, and we're adding in extra gestures here that will repeat and overlap to get us the kinds of accentuations that we want. So let's listen to this and see how it fits together. Very kind of typical, stereotypical, even cliche sort of things going on here. Okay, so let's evaluate what we've done here. One thing that I've done is I took this introductory little line that just occurred as I wrote this, and I turned it into a motivic figure that has repetition. So I took this little line in the violas that happens immediately at the beginning, and I actually spun it out into different areas in the score, particularly near the end. You can see it here. You can see it down here. It's been condensed. You can see it here again in the brass section. And then I've also taken some other things that happen down here in the violas. This little idea, and I use that as well up here in the woodwinds. So I took a couple of little motivic figures and I gave them some extra life in other places and gave them a little bit more meaning, which can really help with the score. If you just have kind of randomization of sounds beginning to end, then you lose identity. It's just stuff. It's as bad. You're going to get kind of my feeling on all of this stuff here now. It's as bad as doing what you do with the atmospheric stuff in synthesizers, right? It's the same kind of badness. It's just cheap and haphazard. If you, though, take these ideas and you give them repetition and life, then you give it intention. And that's what we're trying to do here. So also you can see the things that the winds are doing are in pretty stark contrast to what the strings are doing. They really don't relate to each other in many places. There are some places where there's some doubling, but a lot of it is going to be these short articulation, fanfare kinds of stabs and hits. And then just very sparse moments of melodic application. So that's what we're going for in the underscore. We don't want to create big thematic moments, because when you do that, particularly in an underscore moment, you will distract from the picture. You really only can get away with that whenever the director says, here's a big space with nothing happening other than the action that you see, either emotional action or visual action, and the composer is given full license to create a thematic moment. That doesn't happen very much anymore. Very Spielbergian kind of, and John Williams sort of relationship. Very rare. You see it mostly in animations now. If you look at Pixar and DreamWorks, Disney animation, you'll see a lot more of that kind of stuff happening less and less in live action movies. But we're not after that. We are after underscore. Small motivic, material, mostly about gestures. That's what we're looking for. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to add some percussion to polish off some of the transitions here and add a few more extra hits that might be lacking. Normally I do this often in my writing. I save percussion for last unless there's something really, really important about what a percussion instrument is doing that I want it to do that I'll start with. But usually I will kind of fill out at the end with percussion. This is the way I tend to work. So let's take a look at what that looks like. We'll put in some percussion sounds and just give this a full complement. Okay, so we have some percussion material placed in here, and we've added some timpani and some cymbal and drum work into the mix, and hopefully this will be really the last that we're doing in terms of the addition of instrumental sound. This is not the last step, though. There's one more step when you're working in this way, and you can do this in other types of scoring as well, but when you're working with orchestral instruments, usually there's a lot of enveloping that will be done in the mastering phase. So when we get out of this and we look at the final product, you'll notice that the enveloping is different. What we're going to do when we envelope, and we won't show this process, but you'll see it in the final cut, we will actually increase the normalization and compression and volume of the softer areas just so that they can stick out a little bit more. Right now, MuseScore is going to play this back as if an orchestra is playing it on a stage. Now, MuseScore's algorithms do a little bit of enveloping for like solo instruments. It kind of the artificial intelligence that's behind that engine kind of knows when something is supposed to be heard, and in general it does it pretty well. But we're going to help it along a little bit, and we'll take this final render, throw it into an audio editor, and we'll give it proper enveloping, compression, and then final mastering before we throw it into the picture. But this is what it sounds like in this raw state with our percussion. I'll leave it kind of zeroed in on the percussion section. Okay, so kind of playful. One last thing to note here, and we'll look at what this looks like to picture to kind of finish this out. You'll notice I added one track in the final. After I did my percussion work, what I did is I added in a synthesizer sound, and this is something I just like to do whenever I'm doing commercial kind of music, right? I add a sub bass. So a sub bass is a sound that is an octave below the contrabasses. You don't necessarily have to have it play all the time on everything. I tend to just do that. And then what you do is in the mixer, you set it very, very low. And normally this is something that's done in audio processing later. But I found that using the basic form synthesizer sound in MuseScore, setting it very low, an octave below the basses, kind of accomplishes that sub-bass sound in a way that I really like. So that's just something I've decided to do, and I've been playing around with that. You don't really notice it. That's the goal. It's not something that's noticed, but what it does is it gives a little bit of an extra low-end rumble to everything that makes everything sound much bigger and more supported with a foundation. So a little bit of an additional tweak that I put on there. You can see it looks like it's playing out of range, but because it's a sound font sound, it does play even though it's giving us that red indicator down there. Another thing about ranges, you'll see that I do push the ranges a little bit. I think in your writing, whenever you're writing, don't always go by the ranges that you see in your notation program. Make sure you do some research and that you know instruments, because some instruments have a little bit more capability than what the MuseScore people think, or what the conservative estimations are that they're giving, or Finale or Sibelius, whoever you're using. So you know, if you have to have people play it, know who's going to play it. If you're not going to have people play it and it's a mock-up, just know what the real professional ranges are and what capabilities are, and stick with those rather than just the generic indications that are in your music. So let's listen to this now. We'll envelope it, and then we'll put it onto the picture and see what it looks like in final product. Okay, so that is the final outcome, and just a few things about this. I mean, obviously you don't have to score this way. There's a lot of options that could have been done, as is the case with all three of these styles that we're looking at. There's a little bit about this that is kind of Mickey Mousey, and that's okay. I think that's kind of what we're going for. I think the one thing I'll say, just in my point of view, is that working with orchestral music in this way on notation, I think you're more likely to, if this is where your literacy is at. Some people, their literacy is really in workstations, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. If that's where it's at for you, and that's where you're going to write, that's perfectly fine. I would, though, implore people to evaluate the orchestral complement and understand the breadth that you have with it, that really surpasses kind of the limitation to just sample libraries and synth sounds. When you're working with an orchestral lineup, so a woodwind section, a brass section, a percussion section, strings, you actually, I think, approach more what music is capable of doing. What is its potential when you broaden the ensemble and lean into these kinds of more classic instrumentation. So this is more detailed than what you get with the other two types of composition, and I think it's unfortunate that we've gotten so far away from this as if it's some kind of bad thing. I think that these scores are far more customized to pictures when you're using kind of this complement. And then you add on to that and pick spotted cues where maybe you do something a little bit more out of the box with synthesizers and percussion and whatever, and samples and soundscapes. But I think, unfortunately, we've gotten so far away from this type of scoring that the notable film scores are not that great. A little bit of a heads up on my feeling if we circle back and kind of evaluate the types that are out there. But anyway, I much prefer working in this way. I think there's just so much more potential for it to relate to people. It sounds like a person made it whenever you're listening to this. It sounds like a person is speaking to you, I think, with this type of scoring, and it's just a benefit that it has. So anyway, hopefully you enjoyed this little series in different types, and certainly there'll be some criticism as the way I went about it, and that's fine. Go ahead and put it in the comments section. We'll have a discussion. But hopefully you enjoyed it, and until the next time, happy mixing.